I liked this project a lot because it challenged me in areas of modelling, rigging, and building character design ideas. For example, my first designs that I made for the initial inspiration of the adventure model was these first three. I had to take in consideration of the armour they were wearing. If there were too many pieces, that would be too complicated. That mildly put me off. But I was really happy with the three designs that I first came up with, as they all express some sort of variety in age, skin colour, height, and gender. Second designs, same, except I focused more on the build of the character. So here was a more bulky character, characters that had slimmer builds, ones that needed less armour, but clothes design, all that. My final design I chose on was this middle green one. However, the rest of them, it was very difficult to choose, as I all liked them and they all had their own characteristics, which I think is something I developed on a lot. Working on the actual design, I added some features and added more shape to them as well. As this stage I could refine more on what I actually wanted them to look like based off the sketch I had done. I also made a more simplistic one for the first part of the model, but I think I did do really well in capturing the characteristics of their face, as well as making it as realistic as I could. Here is the development of where I was progressing with the character. For example, the front cloth, it had too much texture in it. I smoothed it out too much. So when I went to the rigging process, I had to go back, remake this part, so it was easier to rig and it was easier to move around, as I didn't need as much texture in it as I thought I needed. Another thing is the belts. I added more belts that were closer to the skin, overlapping, more detail to them, as well as the knee pads. In here they're more flat, but I bulked them out more to give them more of a thicker look, as the material is metal rather than a flimsy look. Another thing I said about the hands is the first design of them, the base of the hand was a lot longer versus when I went into near the rigging part for it. I decided to make the wrist smaller by grabbing the lines here and extruding them inwards. I had to be careful because the hands got very distorted when I was doing all of this. Another thing is the face. It was definitely a challenge trying to get the ear to the right shape, as again it distorted a lot. So I had to go into the project, smooth it as best I could without mushing it all together. I did like creating the eyes. I got an oval, split it in half, and I extruded out the bottom edge to make an eyelash. Another thing I actually really liked modelling was the hair. The hair, again, I used a circle and I made it into more an oval shape. I curved it until I liked the shape of it, and I duplicated and overlaid it using the reference I had drawn. I also went off my own initiative of what the model should look like realistically, as well as adding a hair cap, so we had the more shaved part of the hair, so I could add a texture onto it to it later, as well as taking consideration of her eyebrows. The last thing I also had under the challenges was the boots. The original design of the boots, on this one, the rims at the bottom didn't stand out enough and they were all mangled up together. Remeshing it in some areas, as well as refining it down to look more like a rim on the bottom of the shoe, which I'm really happy how it turned out. The next thing I had to focus on was the weapon. The weapon itself, the original design on the first concept. So in drawing the weapon, I decided to add more details to it, that were more simplistic to it. But again, I had to change it in the modelling process, which I had to do over and over again until I was happy with the result. And the shape of the overall weapon, as I had to go in and out between sharpening an edge, hardening an edge, softening an edge, and smoothing out the object, separating between the two. So the weapon itself has a mixture of hard edges and soft edges, which I really like the look of. Here is the overall development of the 3 different stages I went through. I did have to change a lot, which I can see more clearly when they're referenced side by side, especially with the boots, as they look more like they're touching the ground. Another thing I take into consideration is the trousers, and some of the features I had smoothed with a 3 key, which became an issue in the rigging process, so I had to go back and fix it, going into it and unsmoothing it, and then smoothing it again with being cautious of the fact that I didn't want to add too many faces onto its object, and I didn't want to overcomplicate the model. When it came to rendering the model, I had to think about the textures here. Again, it is different from the original design, but I like the direction I went in. The things I did keep original were the gold outlines on some of the belts and the fabric. To make the fabric more shiny, as I used standard surface, but for the more material part I used a Lambert. Another thing I had to take into consideration was her hair. Her hair had to be slightly different from the shaved hair on the side, a bit lighter, which I had to experiment with the colours a lot. Overall, I am quite happy with the design. The most challenging part I found of the project was, again, the rigging. The modelling, although it came with its complications, was a lot quicker to get through than the rigging process, as when I did start to do the rigging, a lot of complications came up where I have to go back and forth between making the model more appropriate for the rigging. I had to smooth out some areas, dip out some areas. Also, the skinning part did become a complication in some areas, but using the different rigging tools I managed to make it so. One complication I found in rigging was the attachment between the leg, the ankle, and the boot. That I had to recreate a lot of times because the complications were the boot or the leg would not be attached. It would be attached, but it wouldn't be fully attached, and it'd be unhinged inside some way. Overall, I am actually proud how the rigging turned out, as most of the model was fine except from some areas of the hand. Another thing I actually added in, originally I didn't have a rig around the material at the front, but when I had to re-rig it, I realised I needed that because it would stop the separation, it would stop the attachment between the leg and the fabric, and it wouldn't distort as much, as well as I would be more freely able to move it, which was a good choice. Next is onto the background modelling. The character themselves, I wanted to focus on a more deserty kind of theme. So originally I was going to go with a more desert kind of city, but looking at more references, I decided to go with this more like rubbly kind of cave entrance, which I really like the design of. When starting to build this, there weren't actually many challenges I found. The only challenge I did find was texturing the rock, but at the start, to make these shapes of the rocks and that, I got a square and I simply just changed and added more layers to the edge of the curve to make them look smoother, as well as to make them look more jagged, because I could use the same shapes to create multiple different shapes. For example, the best I can see is when I stretch out the object, the stone looked more jagged upwards, but if I squished it, I can make it into layers which looked really nice. Another thing I took into consideration was, not in the original design, but when I was making the design and rendering it in and out again, I found that it probably would have looked better with more rocks around the edge to fill the space. I experimented with some textures like water at the bottom, which made it a lot easier to create the bridge, as the bridge at the front originally was supposed to be connected by strings, which in itself is complicated, and I didn't want to overcomplicate the project. So I added beams that went down into the water and the stone, which I think worked really well, and I'm glad I went in this direction. The textures themselves is something I had to experiment with a lot, as I found out that more detailed textures didn't work that well with this kind of stone. So I went in and created more simplistic, warm tone stones, as I got the colour I wanted and I didn't have to add light to it, but I also got the texture I wanted with a little bit of detail in it. I had to think about the darker saturations and the lighter saturations to add in some variety of the stone, but also different kinds of stone to separate it between the background, which is the most obvious choice I did here, with the pillars of the stone being a more grey, but the rest of it being like a warm sandstone. Finally, when it came down to combining it all, I was really proud how it came out, as I could see the variations of the two stones. I also rigged the model to be in a pose that was appropriate to the overall background. The things I textured the most was the main area of, or the biggest areas of stone. For example, the front of the stone, the entrance, the pillars. These are more simplified to give a more chiseled look, like they've been cut into, but this is more jagged now. I didn't add the designs as I tried smoothing it and making the designs more 3D, however that did not turn out that well and I didn't like the look of it, so I reversed it and kept it more blank, which I'm actually glad it did. But overall, I am actually really proud of what it came out as and how it looks, as it gave me lots of experience in modelling backgrounds and characters, especially with all the difficulties it came with.